Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
They soon did. But now, some Americans say things like this.
Capitalism is an evil system set up to benefit the few at the expense of the many.
Really? How is the alternative working out?
There is no fresh bread or meat on sale.
President Obama wants to open our relationship with Cuba.
We will end an outdated approach that for decades has failed to advance our interests.
But what are our interests? Many Americans think communism is just fine.
Who's on your shirt?
Check.
Communism versus capitalism. That's our show tonight.
And now, John Stossel.
Capitalism works. In my lifetime, free markets have lifted 2 billion people out of the misery of poverty. And yet, lots of Americans still sneer at capitalism. It's unfair. It's a scheme where the rich exploit poor people. Even today, when I would think the success of capitalism is so obvious, some countries still turn to forms of communism. Venezuela voted for that just 15 years ago. Hugo Chavez promised higher wages, more power to the people. And voters believe. They voted him into office twice. Cuba went communist 60-some years ago, and progress there basically stopped. Cuba's almost as poor as North Korea today. But the dictators in Cuba say, we're only poor because the Yankee imperialists starve us. They're talking about America's embargo on trade with Cuba and travel to Cuba, and now President Obama proposes to end that.
We will end an outdated approach that for decades has failed to advance our interests, and instead, we will begin to normalize relations between our two countries.
It's about time, say many of us libertarians. Embargoes rarely work. Our embargo just gave the Castro brothers an excuse. They could blame the capitalists for the failure of communism, and the Cuban people suffered needlessly. But plenty of Cuban Americans say it's just wrong to end the embargo. These protesters call the president a traitor. And plenty of Republican politicians oppose ending the ban. Senator Marco Rubio says we should strengthen the embargo. Ted Cruz says Obama's appeasing our enemies.
Right when the regime is struggling, President Obama stepped in to throw an economic lifeline. And I think that presents a serious danger to our national security.
Author Umberto Fontova agrees with Cruz and Rubio. Umberto was born in Cuba. He escaped when he was 7. Tom Palmer of the Atlas Network says this is one time where Obama is right. The embargo hasn't worked. Let's end it. Umberto, I think Tom is right. It hasn't worked. What's the point?
It is not an embargo at all. Last year, this was before the Obama moves, 3 times as many people visited Cuba from the United States as visited in the 1950s.
But they cheat. They go to some other country first.
No, this is perfectly. Now, if you want to include those, it's probably 10 times as many. This is perfectly legal, John, with licenses.
All right, Tom, he says this embargo just isn't tough enough. And if it were, what? The Castro brothers would be gone?
No, if everybody joined it.
I don't follow this at all. You've almost made my case for me. This embargo is not about getting rid of the regime, which was what we were told when it was imposed. It's a failure. It's a policy failure, and it's time to get rid of it. It actually strengthened the Castro regime because their failures are not because of an embargo, but they have an excuse. It's the evil Yankees. They can trade with all the rest of the world.
But the Cuban people don't believe that excuse.
This is a failed policy.
No.
And that really should be a
what would make
point.
it succeed? What's the point?
Containment of Castro's international terrorism sponsoring that he is still doing. To this day, Cuba is listed as a state sponsor of terrorism. The Soviet Union
meaning what? What's he doing? Sending spies to America to find out our...
Speaking of
our
spies,
what?
Cuba is an intelligence trafficker. They steal military secrets from the United States and sell them on the open market.
But any American could steal secrets. Castro, an embargo on Castro isn't going to prevent this.
John, I'm telling you, a U.S. court convicted Ana Belén Montes of the same crimes as Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, and she is suffering right now. The only thing that saved her from going to the electric chair was a plea bargain. She was stealing U.S. secrets.
Tom, your turn.
The idea was you push a wedge between the rulers and the people. Actually, these things systematically draw them closer together. Yes, there are dissidents in Cuba who have a different view, but there are plenty of dissidents who have said clearly this embargo strengthened the Castro
There are not
regime.
plenty. There are a couple. The overwhelming majority favor the embargo, the so-called embargo, because it's not really an embargo.
President Eisenhower started this so-called embargo with partial trade restrictions 1 year after Castro took power. President Kennedy expanded it to ban all trade when he learned that the Russians were shipping missiles to Cuba. He issued
A proclamation ordering a naval and air quarantine of Cuba.
Our goal is not the victory of might, but the vindication of right.
I was 15 then. I thought I was going to die in a nuclear war, but the Russian ships did turn around. Umberto, as far as I know, that's the only real success from this
No, in fact,
embargo.
that's the only failure of the embargo opinion. What really got those missiles out of Cuba, again, documented in my books, according to Khrushchev's own son, Sergei, was Castro's letter to his father saying, press the buttons and launch the missiles. Khrushchev said, these guys are lunatics. Get these exact words, according to his son, get the missiles out of Cuba unless something terrible might happen. So this victory by Kennedy, he got bull.
All right,
They were afraid of Castro.
Let's move on. During the Cold War, here's how Hollywood portrayed Cuba and Castro's revolution.
It was not so long ago that Cuba, the pearl of the Antilles, was a different kind of country. Her hotels a mecca for carefree tourists who flocked from around the Western world. An influx of pleasure seekers that contributed millions to the island's economy. Then Castro came, and the sounds of joy were submerged by the sound of shooting. Castro convinced the Cuban people he was their liberator, and they freely gave him the reins of government, a free hand that he betrayed when he announced he was a Marxist, dedicated to making the island a communist state.
That was Hollywood before Michael Moore and the left took it over. Tom, they really made it sound like pre-Castro Cuba was this paradise where tourists from.
I don't think that's accurate, but there was a big difference between pre and post-Castro. If you tried to leave Cuba, they did not sink your boat, they did not strafe you, they did not murder you, they did not imprison you for attempting to leave, and that really is a big difference.
Batista, the dictator, was a bad guy who favored his cronies. It
No
wasn't
question about
real
it.
capitalism.
No.
You got out when you were 7 years old.
Right.
What happened?
We're going on the plane. We're getting ready to board. Me and my mom, my brother, and my sister. They dragged my dad off. And my mom, you know, she's figured he's going to the firing squad because that's where everybody was going in the days. And she says, okay, we're not leaving the country. We're not leaving. If you can't come, Umberto, then I'm not going with you. My dad turns around just before he goes to the door and he said, you are leaving because whatever happens to me, and he thought he was going to the firing squad, I don't want my children growing up in a communist country. So we came to the United States.
What happened to your father?
He hunts and fishes with his children every weekend now. He got out a few months later.
Well, that's
We had a happy ending, John, but hundreds of thousands of Cuban families did not have happy endings. It's been a terrible. You can sit on any street corner, Miami, Union City, and hear horror stories much worse than mine.
Explain this attitude about communism itself. And that
Yeah.
in order to take power, Castro lied about his intentions. He said this.
We are not communist. Very clear.
We are not communists. I would think today you could say that, and people would say, "Oh, good, we think this may work." But
Right.
it was unpopular before the revolution. He had to lie about it.
He did. Well, obviously he would have never taken power. But you know something?
Well, what do you mean obviously? I don't see why it's obvious.
Well, in Cuba, communism was not. There was a legal communist party in Cuba, by the way, and they posted candidates in elections, and they won very small margin. Communism was
They lost.
tiny. Yeah, they got swamped.
The communist ideology was useful for cementing control. You became dependent on the party, which is to say your loyalty to the regime, for ration cards, for apartment, for your job, for virtually everything. So communism provided a very powerful legitimating ideology for a dictatorship. It made everyone dependent on the dictator.
Once it was established.
Once it was established. But this is not unique. When the communists took power in Eastern Europe, they were not communists in many cases. Of course not. But once they had power, off came the masks.
Agrarian reformers, right?
And then they took over the secret police. That was their primary objective in every country, secret police, and then establishing arrests and solidifying
Communism
power.
is just supposed to mean we're all in this together, comrade. Why does it always become secret police and murder?
The reason is people decide they want to get out of it. You are forced into it. George Orwell put this so well in Animal Farm, predicated on equality for everyone, but as it turns out, all animals are equal, but some are more equal than others. People figure this out at some point, and they want out, but they have to be kept in the prison.
And I should say that Tom Palmer spends most of his life overseas in third world countries, many of them communist. He travels for the Atlas Institute to set up libertarian think tanks and help those groups. You see a lot of the third world.
Well, and I spent a lot of time in the Soviet Union when it was still with us. The evil empire was there. They allowed East Germans to leave when they got to be retirement age, 65. Then you could leave. Because they'd squeeze your life out of you, and they didn't have to pay a pension anymore. It was really sickening, because their view was, we used you up, now get out.
If other Spanish-speaking countries went along with it, what do you think would happen?
What happened to South Africa? What happened to apartheid South Africa? Why was Nelson Mandela freed? An embargo that everyone joined and it was enforced.
Tom, valid point. Supposedly it was sanctions that changed South Africa.
If you look at the whole history of sanctions, it's littered with failure after failure. It's the only one you could argue had some success, but not the economic sanctions.
They haven't worked in Iraq. They didn't work in Japan before World War II.
Right.
I haven't worked in Cuba, though you have your reasons.
Well,
North Korea hasn't worked.
Right, but I say they have worked in Cuba in saving the U.S. taxpayer from getting fleeced. Look, when you see the farm lobby get behind something, you guys really should know what they're up to. It's another raid on us.
Suspicious of the farm lobby. Thank you, Umberto and Tom.
Thanks a lot.
To join this argument, please follow me on Twitter at FBN Stossel. Use that hashtag communism. Or like my Facebook page so you can post on my wall. Later, my adventures in communist Russia. It was not fun being there. And also, an actual communist today presents the case for communism. I look forward to fighting with him. Though I'd rather fight with her. Why is it cool to wear clothing adorned with pictures of communist murderers? The trendiness of communism next.